Hey class, it's Bob Durst, and we're going to get started with Introduction to Microbiology. Our first chapter is all about microbes and just some basic building blocks. You can think of this one as kind of like a crash course into cell biology. We're going to spend a lot of time flying through some concepts, glossing over some concepts, so that we can have just some very brief background information. Hopefully, this chapter is a whole bunch of review for you. Now, for those of you who get really excited about microbiology, like I do, you might want to read a book called Microbial Hunters. Microbial Hunters is broken up into, I want to say, like 15, 20-page short essays about major figures throughout the history of microbiology. So there's a chapter on Antoine von Leeuwenhoek, there's a chapter on Louis Pasteur, there's chapters on Saladin, there's chapters on major players throughout the course of microbial history. What I love about this book is it tells you, it gives you background on their quirks, their interests, their personal lives. A lot of times in science, it's very easy to separate the fact and the science from the person who spent their life, their career, researching that fact. So, enough about that supplemental reading. By the way, just if you want to read it, I have a copy. Let me know. I'll let you loan it to you. Microbes, they're small and tiny. So when we talk about microbiology, we're looking at this term micro. Micro is a prefix that means small. Bio means life. Ology means study of. So microbiology is quite literally, if we look at the root words, is the study of small life. It's an area of biology that really specializes in something that's so small we can't see it unless we have some kind of optical magnification. When we look at microorganisms, they include bacteria, archaea, and protozoa. Most of our course is going to be spent focusing on bacteria because this is a course that has a nursing emphasis. Our textbook is fabulous, and I highly recommend that you read through the entire textbook over the course of this semester. Archaea is the new kid on the block. It's kind of like a cross between a standard eukaryotic cell and a bacteria. You can think of an archaea as a simple eukaryotic cell that can live in really harsh environments. And then we also have protozoa. All of these guys are bacteria, archaea, and protozoa are always going to be unicellular or one-celled organisms. Then we have fungi and algae. Fungi and algae are kind of either or. They kind of go back and forth depending on the species. Some fungi are going to be single-cellular or unicellular. Sometimes they'll be multicellular organisms. Same with algae. Most algae is going to be unicellular, and most fungi is going to be multicellular fungi. And then there are always the exceptions. The exception for fungi is yeast. Yeast is a unicellular fungi, and that's that wonderful fungi that we use to ferment alcohol or ethanol for us. Most fungi are multicellular fungi that we can see with our naked eye. Think of bread molds, or think of, another good example? You could think of a mushroom, for example. A helminth is a parasitic worm. So when you see the term helminth, think worm that causes harm to larger organisms. All helminths are multicellular organisms, but they still typically are going to be microscopic in nature. And then finally we have viruses. This one's hard to categorize, and we'll talk more about it later with a chapter on viruses. Viruses are smaller than a cell. Those of you who've taken a biology class know that the cell is the simplest unit of life. A cell is defined as the smallest thing that's alive. So if a virus is smaller than a cell, is it alive? We'll talk more about that later. Let's talk about the nature of microorganisms. They're very easy and very difficult to study. They're easy to study because they reproduce rapidly, they grow easily. It's, generally speaking, pretty easy to grow many microbes in a laboratory setting. So it's easy to reproduce them, it's easy to maintain them, you can have lots of large populations. And for those of you that are interested in studying microevolution or statistical biology or biostatistics, it's wonderful when you can have rapidly reproduce a population size of 1 trillion organisms. On the other hand, microbes are a pain in the butt to study. They are so small you can't see them with your naked eye. So you have to go through staining techniques, special histological techniques to make it so that you can see it with your naked eye. We'll talk more about the techniques later on. A lot of our methods for analyzing or studying microbes involve indirect means, spectrophotometry, mass spec, or you can look at immunological or histo or chemical assays. By the way, when I say assay, I mean test. Assay is a technical term that means a test in a laboratory setting. So you can, on that note, a good example of an assay would be a pregnancy test. A pregnancy test typically is an assay that tests for the presence of human chorionic gonadotropin within a woman's urine stream. Anyways, I digress. Let's have a concept check. Which of the following is not considered a microbe? Is it a bacterium, an algae, a mushroom, or a protozoan? So which one of these guys is big enough that you can see it with your naked eye? If you don't remember, I want you to pause the video, check your textbook, or you can pause the video and check your PowerPoint slides, or rewind the video a little bit. So, pause, unpause. All right, so which of these is not considered a microbe? It is C, a mushroom. A mushroom is not considered a microbe. That is kind of a low-hanging fruit kind of a question, because mushrooms are big enough that you can clearly see them at the grocery store and buy them. So let's talk about how microbes affect our planets. Microbes have been around for a very, very long time. I actually just read a news article yesterday that talked about how the oldest living microbes on our planet are estimated to be millions upon millions of years old. And I'm not talking about microbes that have been reproducing for millions and millions of years, but microbes, individual cells that have remained alive for millions upon millions of years. These microbes have been all over our planet. They have shaped the development of the Earth's habitat. Cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae, are responsible for oxygenating the Earth's atmosphere. 3.5 billion years ago, when microbes first started to appear, when life first started to appear, it happened very recently, very soon after the great cosmic bombardment of our planet, we had microbes on our planet, and they immediately started to terraform our planet. All of our microbes are theorized to have arose from a single common ancestor. And this is the newer theory on the block. This is a theory that's new with this edition, second edition of the textbook. When I went to K-12 primary school and when I went to college and when I went to grad school, it was commonly taught that bacteria were the first ones to arrive, and then archaea, and then finally eukaryotes. Now that theory's been revived. Now the theory states that all three kinds of cells arose from a single common ancestor at approximately the same time. So if we look at a eukaryote, eukaryote means true nucleus. Eu is a prefix that means true. Kary is a term that means kernel. A true nucleus or true kernel cell is a cell that has a nucleus in it, or a true nucleus. Bacteria, for the longest time, were called prokaryotes. Everything that didn't have a nucleus was lumped together into the category of prokaryote. But we found that there's a lot more diversity within that category, so that term prokaryote is now falling out of favor. Now we typically use the term bacteria and archaea. Bacteria do not have a true nucleus. They're always going to be single-celled. You and I are eukaryotes. Eukaryotes can be single-cellular or multicellular. And then finally, archaea are single-celled organisms. They don't have a true nucleus. Some archaea have a pseudonucleus, but not all archaea have a nucleus. Archaea are distinct from bacteria. If you look at the way their DNA is organized, there's different chemical bonds that hold the DNA together in an archaea, and there's different chemical bonds that hold the proteins together within archaea, and these different kinds of chemical bonds that hold the molecules together within archaea make archaea capable of living in really extreme environments. Archaea can live in acidic pools. Archaea can live in boiling ponds full of mud at 600 degrees, or excuse me, at 200 degrees Fahrenheit, temperatures that would kill most everything else. So archaea are kind of tough guys on the block, or sometimes they're referred to as extremophiles. They love living in extreme environments. Enough about that slide. So, bacteria and archaea, as I mentioned, are predominantly or mostly single-cellular organisms. Actually, I can't think of a single multicellular bacteria or archaea off the top of my head, but I'm hedging my bets because one may still be discovered. Eukaryotes can be single-cellular or multicellular. You and me, as human beings, we're pretty complex multicellular organisms. Or you can think of a chimpanzee, or you can think of a lizard or a ladybug. We're big. Eukaryotes, even if they're single-cellular, are pretty big compared to bacteria and archaea. Eukaryotic cells are more complex. They have lots of membrane-bound organelles. I'm going to say that again to emphasize it. Eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles, and they have true nuclei. If you see a nucleus and a bunch of organelles on the inside of the cell that are covered in membranes, it is a eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotes, though, are an underrepresented minority. Or actually, I'm going to rephrase it. They are an overrepresented minority. Most organisms on our planet are not eukaryotic organisms, but you and I, as human beings, have a preferential bias to care about eukaryotic organisms because we can see them. They're big, multicellular organisms, and generally speaking, we find them to be more interesting. We have microbes all over our planet. They are ubiquitous. Ubiquitous is a technical term, or kind of a hoity-toity term that's kind of fallen out of favor. If we were alive back in the 1850s, ubiquitous was part of common speech, but people don't use that word very often anymore. I digress. Ubiquitous is a term that means everywhere. It's common. It's all over the place. Microbes are ubiquitous. They're found deep in the Earth's crust, underneath polar ice caps, inside of bodies of plants and animals. It's actually recently estimated that we as human beings have 10 bacterial cells in our body for every one human cell in our body. Don't quote me on the numbers, but a disturbingly large fraction of our body's mass is actually bacterial mass. And if we removed all of our bacteria from our bodies, we would lose a lot of weight. We'd also probably die pretty quickly too. We need those bacteria to stay alive. I digress. We need microbes in our Earth's landscape. As I mentioned earlier, they help oxygenate the atmosphere, and they still oxygenate the atmosphere, and they are essential to life on our planet. Think of, for those of you who've taken a geology class or an intro to bio class, a good example of how microbes help us is with nitrogen fixation. They take biologically unavailable nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into organically available nitrogen that can be put into the food chain. So let's look at how long we've had microbes on our planets. Ancestral cells, a really long time ago, and those ancestral cells gave rise to the three main cell lines that we have, and from these three main cell lines we get the large multicellular organisms that you and I see and love from the eukaryotic line. Microbes on our planet have been theorized to evolve through a series of natural small mutations, favoring the one that can reproduce the most, essentially through the theory of evolution. I want to emphasize something here. Evolution is not a theory about the origin of life. Evolution does an absolutely terrible job about explaining how life first arose. When it comes to the origins of life, there's not a very good working theory right now. But once there is life, the theory of evolution applies to taking that one kind of life and changing it into multiple species or multiple different organisms. So the theory of evolution is a theory about speciation, how new species came to arise, not how life came to be. Those are separate theories from each other. So, theory of evolution is documented all the time in our planet. And when I say it's documented and observable, I'm talking about microevolution. A good example of that is how an organism can develop, or bacteria can develop, antibiotic resistance. Or if you look in a population of, let's say, birds, and there's a drought, birds, the beak size of a bird will change preferentially over a couple years of drought. This is very testable, and the microevolution has been very, very well documented by science. Some of the controversy surrounding evolution evolves from macroevolution, seeing a brand new species that cannot reproduce or breed with separate species arise. A lot of that has to do with the timetables involved. In science, a theory is very different from a theory in everyday language. When I'm talking to someone on the street, or I'm having a conversation with someone outside of the classroom or outside of the professional realm of science, if I say I have a theory, what I mean is I have a hunch, I have a guess. Within the context of science, when I say I have a theory, I mean I have an idea or a concept that's been tested for a long time and is supported by a wide body of evidence, or a large body of evidence. It's not a random guess. A good example, or another analogy would be, in common speech or in everyday common tongue, I would say I have a theory, to say that I have a hunch about something. If I want to use an equivalent term in academic speak or in technical science speak, I would say I have a hypothesis, an educated guess. So, concept checked. True or false? The theory of evolution is not widely accepted among scientists because it still remains unproven. And this depends on your definition of proof. If you've taken a lot of math classes, you know that to prove something, you need to go through some derivations, and that you need to test every possible permutation of the scenario. From an empirical sense, or from an observational sense, it is impossible to prove a theory, because there are always going to be an infinite number of ways to potentially misprove a theory. Therefore, there's an infinite amount of time required to test that the infinite number of possibilities that could potentially disprove a theory. So from an empirical or a measurable experimental perspective, it's impossible to prove any theory. And I'm being very pedantic or anal retentive about my word choice right now. If we looked at it from a mathematical perspective, where we could derive an equation or derive a math-based proof, it is possible to prove a theory. The theory of evolution is not a theorem based within the realm of mathematics. Because it's not a theorem based within the realm of mathematics, it is not proven or unproven. With that said, there's a very wide body of evidence that supports the theory of evolution. So at this point, to be pedantic or technically true or technically correct, I need to say false. It remains unproven, even though there's a very, very wide body of evidence to support it. And it's going to be technically impossible to prove or disprove this theory just because of the time scales involved. Moving on. How have microbes shaped our planet? I've already mentioned cyanobacteria, how they have oxygenated our atmosphere. This is through the process of photosynthesis, where we take energy from light, carbon dioxide, and water molecules, and we turn that into sugars, particularly glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen gas. We also have anoxygenic photosynthesis, or photosynthesis that does not make oxygen. So this is going to occur before we had the traditional photosynthesis. This is very, very efficient at extracting oxygen from sunlight. This process, though, isn't very popular. And it's not very popular within the realm of life, because organisms that go through anoxygenic photosynthesis without producing oxygen need to do this in an environment that has no oxygen present. These organisms that do this kind of photosynthesis find oxygen to be a toxic chemical. And we, as human beings, do find oxygen in high concentrations to also be toxic. However, most organisms that we care about, where's my mouse? Here's my mouse, like to go through oxygenic photosynthesis that makes oxygen. And since after these organisms make that oxygen, they are going to be exposed to the oxygen that they made, so they need to have mechanisms in place to cope with that oxygen. So these organisms that made oxygen from photosynthesis essentially made the planet unfavorable, or most of the planet unfavorable, to the organisms that cannot tolerate the presence of oxygen. Another way that microbes have shaped our planet is they have changed the content of the water, the atmosphere, and the soil. I had mentioned earlier how we have the nitrogen cycle, but we also have the carbon cycle as well. Microbes will, as part of the carbon cycle, take carbon dioxide and turn it into methane, and back and forth, back and forth. Usually, glucose is going to be an intermediate in this process. These are potent greenhouse gases. Another potent greenhouse gas not mentioned is water. And the reason water is not mentioned on this is because most of the water on our planet did not come from life. Most of the water was just naturally present on our planet. Our microorganisms on our planet are the single most abundant kind of life on our planet. They're really small. You can fit a lot of them into a small space. So, of course, we're going to have more individual microbes on our planet than we'll have individual elephants on our planet. Of these microbes, viruses, the smallest of them all, is the single most common, particularly in the ocean. There are startlingly there are just ridiculously high concentrations of viruses in ocean water. The good thing about this is most of those viruses specialize in killing bacteria. Most of them are bacteriophages that have no effect on human beings, thankfully. We have lots of bacteria and fungi that live in association with plants. Think of legumes or nitrogen-fixing plants. They have nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the nodules of the roots. Or we can think of us as human beings. A hot topic of research right now is the Microbiome Project, which studies the relationship between human beings and the microbes in our guts and how we work together to have good health and well-established immune systems. I also should mention on the obtaining nutrients that we get most of our vitamin K from the microbes that live in our colon, the E. coli that lives in our colon. So, concept check. Microbes are everywhere on the planet except the deeper layers of the Earth's crust, which are largely considered to be sterile. So, true or false? Ooh, that should be a B right there instead of an A. A true, B false. Pause the video and or rewind the video, or you can flip back into your PowerPoint slides. Okay, the answer is false. Microbes are every stinking where on our planet, even really deep down in the soil or in our Earth's crust. Let's talk about how microbes and humans interact with each other. Traditionally, humans have used microbes for things like fermentation or for leavening. So during bread production, we have leavening agent with bread. Yeast or Candidus albicans. We can use Candidus albicans for alcohol production. We use many different kinds of microbes for cheese production. Here's some nice trivia for you right now. Currently in the United States, there is an estimated 1 billion pounds of extra cheese that needs to be consumed by our country. We have a surplus of cheese, which I get very excited about. Apparently we have too many microbes right now making too much cheese for us. We also use microbes to treat wounds and lesions traditionally. A good example of that would be some tinctures or poultices that were traditionally made by taking elephant dung or other animal refuse that was high in that had high bacterial concentrations and rubbing it on a wound. This is still a method that's widely used in some parts of Africa and contributes to a lot of sepsis and wound infection. I didn't say treating wounds with microbes is a good thing. I'm just saying that it's still done. We also have a lot of mining of precious metals that's been done by microbes. Right now there are some strains of bacteria that are being engineered to remove gold from the leftover tailings or leftover ore from mines. Hopefully we'll get to the point where that's more cost effective right now. Currently the most popular method for removing gold from soil and tailings from a mine involves cyanide treatment. And then finally we use microbes for bioremediation, cleaning up human waste products or human environmental accidents. The classic example right now is if you have an oil spill, certain breeds of bacteria have been cultured to preferentially eat up that oil that's spilled into the environment. We can genetically engineer microbes. This is a pretty easy process. Anybody who's gone through a couple years of college will typically have genetic engineering lab activity in their microbiology lab, or their molecular biology lab, or their cell biology lab. So for those of you who decide to get a degree in biochemistry, or maybe you want to be pre-med, usually by your junior year you're going to start manipulating the genome of microbes. Or we can use that technology to modify the genome of larger organisms that are multicellular. Just for the sake of full disclaimer, I spent 3 years working in a lab making GMOs for crop species. And I'll leave it at that. Recombinant DNA technology is a term that means that we'll recombine DNA. So if we look at the root word of recombinant, it's recombining. So we'll take a little bit of DNA from organism A and a little bit of DNA from organism B and combine them together. So we'll take DNA from different organisms and mix and match them together. Bioremediation, as I mentioned on the last slide, is when we take a microbe and use it to clean up a mess. Excuse me. Overwhelmingly, most of the organisms in the environment don't do anything for us. They don't hurt us, they don't help us, they're just kind of there. It's like that ant living in an ant hill, on that hill in the middle of nowhere. You just don't care what it's doing. It's just minding its own business. We mind our own business. It's cool. Some organisms, though, make us sick, or have diseases. These are the stinky, irritating buggers. We call these ones pathogens. So when I say pathogen, I mean any kind of a microbe that makes us sick or causes a disease. It could be a protozoa, it could be a helminth, it could be a bacteria, it can be a eukaryote, it can be a virus. We have identified over 2,000 different disease-causing microbes, or different pathogens. Of these 2,000 disease-causing pathogens that we've identified, they cause over 10 billion diseases or individual infections every year in the world. And this number just keeps going up. Infectious diseases are still the single most common cause of death worldwide. If you're looking for low-hanging fruit in terms of curing diseases, you could focus on, in third world countries, things like clean water. You get a lot of bang for your buck. There are a lot of infectious diseases that affect the third world that stem from dirty water or contaminated water sources that we don't deal with here in the developed world because we have more sanitation. So let's talk about some of the big diseases on the world right now that are emerging or re-emerging. AIDS is a big one, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV virus. Hepatitis C is very dangerous right now because there is no treatment for it, and you can contract hepatitis C after the sample is sat in the environment for a very long time. Hepatitis C remains virulent for an extremely long time. The West Nile virus is a mosquito-transmitted virus. One that didn't make the book, or this edition of the textbook, Zika virus, which is all over the news right now. And then tuberculosis, which is one that scares the living daylights out of me. Right now in the Russian prison systems and in Southeast Asia, there are strains of tuberculosis that are resistant to every known antibiotic that we have. And it's only a matter of time before those strains of bacteria make it to North America. Some diseases are correlated with a microbe. It's not necessarily that they are always caused by, but they can be correlated with the presence of this microbe. A good example is a gastric ulcer or a stomach ulcer. It can be caused by Helicobacter pylori, a specific species of bacteria, or sometimes gastric ulcers or stomach ulcers happen when there is no Helicobacter pylori present. For example, or we can look at cancers. Sometimes a cancer can be triggered by a microbe. Other times the cancer is not triggered by the microbe. It's now believed that there's a virus that may be associated with causing diabetes, the Coxsackie virus, and then there's the boron agent, which is believed to be associated with causing schizophrenia. As we have more and more patients in the world, more and more of them are going to have weakened defenses. It's just a numbers game. Particularly as we have more patients contracting HIV. These individuals that have weakened defenses are going to be infected by microbes that normally are not pathogenic. So if we look at a specific microbe, it can bounce back and forth between the pathogenic disease-causing state or the non-pathogenic, I don't really care that much about it state. For someone that's immunocompromised, microbes that normally would not make them sick do make them sick. So if you are immunocompromised, there are more pathogenic microbes that would affect you in the world. This increase in microbes that are resistant to drugs, particularly antibiotics, is of major concern to all of us because we need antibiotics for surgeries. We need antibiotics for patients that have organ transplants. We need antibiotics to get over lots of sniffles and sniffs and colds. Here is a breakdown of the United States compared to the world. Heart disease, cancer, and lower respiratory diseases. These are, and cerebrovascular disease, are the big killers in the United States. These are the killers of the developed world. So heart disease and cerebrovascular disease can translate as a heart attack or a stroke. Cancer is very hard to avoid. The longer you live, the more mutations you occur in build up in your genome, eventually leading to cancer. And then chronic lower respiratory disease is another way of saying lung cancers or lung infections. So we look at individuals that have been smoking. Eventually, it catches up with them. Now, if we look at the top killers in the worldwide, we have more diseased-based organisms. We have lower respiratory infections, not just lower respiratory disease. So when I say lower respiratory disease, I mean things like emphysema or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. When I say lower respiratory infections, I mean things like influenza or pneumonia. Diarrheal diseases is a huge killer worldwide. Approximately 1.9 million people die worldwide from diarrhea-based diseases, compared to HIV/AIDS, which kills approximately 1.5 million people worldwide. The kicker is, and this is the part that just rocks my world, is it's so easy to prevent diarrheal diseases. Have clean water. As opposed to preventing or treating HIV/AIDS, making clean water or giving someone some simple over-the-counter medications doesn't cure or prevent HIV/AIDS, unfortunately. If you haven't noticed, for me, clean water worldwide is a big sticking point. I digress. Let's move on from this slide. So we have a lot of diseases. The United States has more diseases that are associated with lifestyle choices. Worldwide, more people die from diseases that are based off of microbial sources. So, true or false? Diseases such as heart disease, gastric ulcers, diabetes, and multiple sclerosis have a microbial cause. True or false? The answer is maybe. And that's the pretty lame answer. Sometimes there's a microbial cause, sometimes there's not a microbial cause. A better way to phrase this question would be a microbial correlation. The microbes have been linked to these diseases, but they do not cause these diseases in every single situation.